All right, everybody, welcome back again. We are going to, again, try the PowerPoint presentation method for another turn and see if you still can get used to it. If not, again, like I said, let me know and we can go back to you guys looking at me. So let's go ahead and continue on 27.4 here now, the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to cover a few points in the Civil Rights Movement that hopefully some of you are familiar with, and if not, you're about to learn them today. So let's just jump right on into it. The very first thing we're going to look into when they start to push further for equal rights and moving away from being segregated, they try to start to fight public desegregation now. So they've made their way into the school systems and they're able to start desegregating the schools. The next thing to do to remove themselves from the invisible person viewpoint is that they are going to assert their rights to be in public spaces and not to be segregated in those public spaces. And one of the very first movements of these is the Montgomery bus boycott. So there's two cases of it, but the very first one, of course, is in Montgomery, Alabama. Claudette Colvin refuses to give up her seat and is arrested. Now, that's not necessarily where this starts off, but she's the very first one who tries to take a stand that is notable in history. Instead, what we all know is the one that on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks is sitting on the bus. And now, the famous thing is she's sitting on the front of the bus. She's actually sitting about in the middle of the bus. And she's in there, and she's tired after a long days of work, of course, but at the same time, most people don't realize this. She is she's an activist. And so she was looking for a way to be able to signify that they no longer belong in the fringes of society and they can't be pushed around anymore. So she's sitting on the middle of the bus, and as it starts to fill up and white people start to fill onto the bus, she is expected to get up out of her seat and move to the back of the bus. This is an expectation for them in society. Again, when we talk about, remember, we're looking at the invisible person. They are being told to be out of the way and move out of the way if they are in the way. That's just an expectation that they're supposed to live up to. Rosa Parks refuses to live up to that expectation and refuses to move. All in all, again, she goes ahead and she gets arrested. And she's taken to jail. But this is a rallying cry that the NAACP uses to really motivate African Americans to stand up for their rights. So what they do is they initiate a bus protest. They say that we are not going to ride the buses anymore. We are not going to get on the buses. We're not going to pay to use the buses. They become very creative with how they go about it. And they move to different methods such as taking bicycles, or they also start carpools where people who have cars in the Black African American community will drive over and pick up people and take them to work. If worst comes to worst, they'll walk to work. So they really put the tightening onto the bus company that they're not going to get on their buses until they end this segregation policy that they had going on. And initially, some of the bus companies, when they start looking at this, they realize that this is going to cost them a lot of money because a vast majority, over 75% of their bus ridership was the African Americans. And so the bus companies start to strategize of how they can try to end this. But as it's going through this, the boycott really gains steam and it continues on. In fact, it is used as a rallying cry to the point that they start to bring in other people to help manage the boycott. It grows so fast and so quickly. And one of these individuals that shows up at one of these meetings is the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And what happens is that these meetings that start to occur in the black communities are really driven by the churches. And so when we worked through our writing project that you guys just barely finished up, you will remember that some of the speeches that you were reading come from some of these events where, for example, Martin Luther King is at a church and he gives his very famous speech about leading the boycotts, but also he is calling for nonviolence. Remember when we read at that very first part of it, when we were going over that review and we were reading and learning how to really deep dive, The key critical point, that one of the things I wanted you to pull out is that he believed there was a justification to be violent, but that they'd get better results by being nonviolent. And because of his speaking ability and his knowledge and overall just his education level, he became a distinct high-profile leader that was great for advocacy because he was good on camera, he was eloquent, he could write. Most people don't realize that how educated he was. He didn't just go to school and learn to become a minister, but he also went to school and studied philosophy. So he studied some of the greatest thinkers of the entire human experience, and he used their ideas, and he brought those ideas forth in the idea of nonviolent protest. So he was able to reason with people on a higher level than just using religious language. He could use moral language that had been developed throughout the ages by numerous philosophers, and that's why he was so effective as what he was doing. And another thing is that he looked at the idea of the fights that they were in not just simply as a battle of race, but a battle of good and evil. One of the things he said, for every racist there was 5 non-racists. And his belief was that if he could stand up and they could non-violently protest and they could be seen as people being abused by other racist people, that eventually the moral compass of America and the moral compass of non-racist individuals would come to the aid of the African American community and make corrections. And so that was one of the things that he was really pushing for, is if we can keep this nonviolent, that we can show that we truly are the good people in this fight, and that we are not the ones out there committing acts of violence. We're not engaged in violent protest. We're not trying to end America. All we're trying to do is become equal and have a level playing field like everybody else. That's one of the things that he's really pushing for during this time frame. The bus boycott itself goes on for a very long time and lasts over a year. And initially their plan was just maybe a few days, but they become motivated to the point that they realize that this is making an impact. It's getting media coverage. And as it continues to go longer and longer, more and more people are drawn to the cause, and more people show up to the protests, to the marches. The bus companies eventually look at it and say, we really have to move back and just desegregate these buses. We're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, by not having any African American ridership. And so as they're talking and they're planning on potentially desegregating, the city council steps in and says, there's no way you're going to desegregate these buses. It's just not going to happen. This is the law. This is what we're passing. You cannot do that. And eventually it becomes violent, doesn't become violent yet. It becomes agitated with each other to the point that there are calls for violence, but nothing does come about it from the African American community side. Instead, when I was going to speak about violence starts occurring against the African Americans by the racist whites in the South. They start to bomb houses. They start to bomb churches. They shoot at people's homes. Martin Luther King's home was attacked multiple times by people shooting at it and blowing up bombs outside of it. This really paints that picture of good versus evil. Here is a good, worthy group of people out there fighting for symbolic rights, more than just symbolic, for their actual rights. And they're really trying to present themselves as, look, we are not the instigators of violence here. Instead, we are the subjects of violent repression of our rights. These people are acting against us. And one of the things that they try to do during this time, a lot of the white Southerners really push the idea that, oh no, these groups like the NAACP and these church groups that Martin Luther King belongs to are communist in nature, which was untrue. In fact, if you read anything by Martin Luther King, you'll notice that he does repudiate communism frequently. Now, admittedly, during any of these types of events, you will have radicals who show up and try to infiltrate the ranks. And that's sometimes where some of these ideas came, where they would be able to point and say, hey, look, there is a communist over there, but it was not the movement itself. And the reason why they try to label it as a communistic movement, though, is, again, we just talked about this. There's a scare out in America that communism is trying to destroy the social fabric of America. And so these Southerners are trying to put out there and say, see, look, they're trying to change our way of life. And they're not trying to change their way of life. They're just trying to be known and have an equal chance and equal representation. That's what they were searching for in their lives. Eventually, Martin Luther King was arrested during this time using multiple older laws. They say he was trying to use a boycott to end like capitalistic use of facilities or some nonsense like that. They just managed to be able to jail him. And eventually, though, he is bailed out. He's arrested a number of occasions throughout the civil rights movement. So once it's successful, and eventually the boycott does end because the Supreme Court does rule that they have to desegregate the buses. So once they see that this is a successful tool into which they can move change, they continue to use boycotts effectively. And so one of the things, though, is that they would boycott businesses that engaged in discriminatory practices. They would encourage other people to also to avoid doing business with those companies. They would label them and say, hey, look, these people are racist in nature. And one of the things they really do is they try to put a face of capitalism over racism. So can the capitalistic system be used to help remove racism from America? Because if they can stop commerce, they can create these types of problems for the business in general. So one of the things that they would do, for example, when we look at sit-ins, there is numerous cases of young African-American college students who showed up like at Woolworths, and they sat down at a table and in chairs that were designated for whites only, and they sat there waiting to be served. And they were forcibly told, you need to leave, we're not going to serve you here. And eventually more protesters show up, and each and every day more and more protesters show up waiting to be served and refusing to leave if they weren't getting served. Again, often they were met by violent means and violent actions to remove them from there, but all under the lights of television cameras and just cameras from newspapers. And what this does is it starts to wake up the rest of the moral-minded of America as to what is happening in the South is not right. And so this starts to awaken people's motivation to be able to look and pressure Congress and the presidents to start passing civil rights legislations. There are some passed under Eisenhower, more are passed under Kennedy, and most of them are passed under Johnson to really bring African Americans in line with their proper rights that they deserve underneath the Constitution. And so a lot of the different methods that they use are extraordinarily effective because, again, they're peaceful in nature. They're not seen as antagonistic. Instead, they're seen as just trying to exercise public rights. And that's one of the things that there is the big debate and disagreement with what's going on here, is that some of these places, such as like a Woolworths, is not a public place in a sense that it's not paid for by tax dollars. So eventually what starts happening in the South is desegregation first happens in federal facilities and then into the taxpayer-funded facilities. They were told that you can no longer discriminate anymore because these are funded by taxpayer dollars. And so that's one of the first things that shift and change is that you have to accommodate them because of taxpayer money. But then the debate comes from the perspective of, well, is it a public place if it's under private ownership? And some people believe that if you are open to the public, that you're willing to serve them and everybody, then you should be able to. But then that also brings up other debates about, if you're a private country club, different things like that. Those are all different perspectives. It's something, if you really want to get deeper into the civil rights movement, you can really look into. But a lot of the rulings start to come out as if you're going to serve the public, you have to serve everybody. You cannot discriminate people. You cannot discriminate service to people based upon race. And eventually it starts to become gender and other items too as we move in about it. All right. So some of the things that they're really great, though, about is that they organize. He founds the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which moves to move protests throughout the South. No longer are they just staying in like Birmingham. They're moving outwards. They're spreading throughout the South. And eventually it's to the point that it's starting to put pressure on all sorts of local leaders to do something different. However, again, many times those local and state leaders would push back and say, this is a states' rights issue, federal government. You need to step away from that. And the same argument of states' rights over federal rights is one of the things that eventually pushed the South to the Civil War initially. So it's kind of ironic that that's what they go right back to again, where they say, well, your federal government can't just impose these rules upon us. And there'd already been a war over it saying, well, yes, they can. So he goes on, though, and he goes throughout the country, especially throughout the South, and he really starts to move these protests and these movements. And then other groups would create what's called freedom rides, where they'd get onto buses and they would drive from city to city to help with like the sit-in protest, because one of the effective strategies was that they would sit at these tables and then a police officer would come in and arrest the 3 people or 4 people who are sitting at the table, and immediately 4 more people would just take their place. So that's why these freedom rides were very important. And what they also do is that they change up just the makeup of what the protest looks like each and every time. So it moves it from being simply a African American only to a diverse protest. So you start to see like white college students start to show up in these African American marches, which are again broadcast and shown on TV. And so it really starts to add that there is an additional element to what is going on here, that it's not just African Americans, there's people who believe that this is a moral cause. So they move into the Birmingham campaign, and one of the things about this is that this one turns ugly quickly. And so what happens is that they start to show up in Birmingham, and they start to go to what they've been doing all along, direct action. They go to counter sit-ins, they protest, they have walk-ins, and people start getting arrested in mass. And eventually the state circuit court rules that you can't protest anymore. These protests are done, they're over, can't continue on with them. And King comes out and says, we cannot just sit back and say that you can end our right to protest. We're not doing anything dangerous. We're not being violent. We are peaceably assembling. And so with that, he gets arrested and he's thrown into jail, and they have run out of money by this point to be able to bond him out any further. And this is where he writes that famous letter that many of you hopefully have read, which was Letter from Birmingham Jail. But the marchers continue on in the face of, growing danger. And what happens is that Commissioner Connor decides at this point that he's done with the protests. And so right in front of all television cameras throughout the region, in front of newspaper reporters, they let loose dogs. They use high-powered water spray. They use tear gas. They use cattle prods. They use clubs. They just mercilessly attack and they beat these protesters. And they hurt them and they harm them. And it's not just college students that are involved in this. There's women and children that are being beaten and hit and being attacked by dogs in these protests. And it's one of the most visceral images of how horrible the Southern treatment is for African Americans. And this really starts to turn the tide right here by seeing unarmed, nonviolent protesters attacked and beaten mercilessly by the police state. And this is what really motivates a lot of people to start pressuring the federal government to truly step in and make a difference and pass these laws. And John F. Kennedy eventually is forced to bring down troops in order to calm these types of activities down there. So eventually what happens is that the movement, though it continues to expand, one of the most influential moments of this movement is when in 1963, King and all the other civil rights leaders that are really associated with them, they march on Washington, and it's a peaceful march. Again, critical element to understanding the civil rights movement is it's peaceful in nature. And they show up, and he gives his famous I Have a Dream speech on the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial. And I highly encourage you guys to go out and listen to that speech and listen to how he's calling for Americans to come together, to live together, and that men and women and children are not separated by race, but they are instead a shared humanity, and that's how they should be treated and seen. Unfortunately, even though he did see a number of the civil rights legislation passed, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And assassination becomes a tool that many disturbed people start to utilize in the 1960s so that they too can try to create societal change. And we'll talk about 2 of the other most important assassinations of the 1960s in our next unit. All right, guys, I know this one was a little bit longer, but again, these are subject matters that sometimes need to be covered in depth, and I really feel that it's a benefit for you guys. This is the end of this unit of this chapter. So what we are going to do is, after tomorrow, we're going to have a review session on Friday, and then you guys need to be prepared to test on Monday. All right, guys. Well, thanks again for joining me with this video. Leave me some feedback if you like this format. If not, also do so. And I will see you guys again soon.